So, ladies and gentlemen, as you aware, this is our annual general meeting. It's a special evening for us too, as a council and the staff of the graduate union. And in particular, this evening is to recognise Dr. Phillip Law. And as you know, he was very generous in requesting to us a very large sum of money, which has allowed us to undertake some very significant and needed maintenance and improvements to our buildings. It was conditional that the money be used for buildings. So tonight we've named the dinner in honour of him. You can see that the staff have not only produced a very elegant set of tables for us that we were greeted with as we walked in, but they've also have a little bit of a theme that hopefully you've all observed, such as ice, which Dr. Law was very familiar with, and therefore the roses on your table are a very close match to the colour of ice. And also the menus on the table of Antarctic related pictures. So I think it's very fitting, and we thank the staff for looking after us so well. We had invited Dr. Phillip Law's brother to be here with us tonight. Unfortunately, he's quite frail and he couldn't be with us. We particularly wanted to be here because not only did he represent his brother, but we would be able to show him how the council is trying to recognise the generosity of Dr. Law. And the way in which we are proposing to do that is that at the far end of the room there is a drawing which you need to get a bit closer to appreciate. But a small working party of the council has been working with a bronze sculptor, and he has produced this design, and I really ask you to go and have a look at it, and the text beside it explains the story that's in that image, which represents the flow of Dr. Law's life from starting in the foreground in the Antarctic and moving off through a path which you can see to the mountains in the distance, and beside that path the stones and the objects and whatever are softer in their look compared to those same objects as they drift out to the side of the sculpture, meaning that where Dr. Law has been, he's made an impact on life on the earth, because he's softened the image as he went along this path to those distant mountains. So it's a great story that the picture tells when you understand it. So please have a look at that. It's been generously, it will be generously donated to us by a benefactor, and like all good benefactors, they prefer to be anonymous. So we are very grateful to that benefactor or benefactors, and it will be a very lasting recognition of not only what he's done for Graduate House, but what he's done for Australia, because he's a marvellous man when you read about him. And so therefore, the area right here and the comfortable seats are inside the bar, we will be naming, or we're proposing that the council will adopt, that area be named the Dr. Phillip Law Members Lounge, and that sculpture, which I think will be slightly a little bit larger than that, will be actually on the wall just outside there, with the same explanation beside it, so that it'll be a long-lasting, very solid recognition of his generosity and contribution to Australia. The text at the bottom of that describes many of his attributes: sportsman, musician, educator, many aspects to his life. So please have a look at that after dinner. And continuing the theme of acknowledging Dr. Law, we're very fortunate tonight to have with us another Antarctic explorer, expedition I should say probably, Fredrick Elliott, or the Fredrick assures me that we can all refer to him as Fred, so I'll take that liberty from now on. Fred met Dr. Law in 1949 and thereafter participated in expeditions to Heard Island and Antarctica. And during 1958, Fred was awarded the Polar Medal for distinguished service. In more recent years, he's turned his hand to drawing and various artistic pursuits like that, and has had some significant exhibitions in the country. So I don't want to steal any more of his thunder. So I'd now like to invite Fred to come to the rostrum and share his memories of Dr. Law with us. Thank you, Fred.
thank you for the welcome. It's good to be here and to be able to talk about. I've never called Dr. Law anything else but Phil, I think, so he'll be referred to as Phil right throughout. On Saturday, the 13th of February, 1954, I was one of a group of men, a couple of dozen of us, standing in a semicircle at Horseshoe Bay in McRobertson Land, while Phil read out the proclamation confirming Australia's claim to that area and also naming the place Mawson. The national anthem was sung fairly self-consciously. You know, it meant like standing out in the open singing the national anthem. There's quite a lot of versions of the tune. It was self-consciously sung, and Phil gave the nod to Dick Thompson to unfurl the flag. Phil had done all the necessary reading out the proclamation and so forth, and the end of it was, after singing the national anthem, okay, the flag had to be unfurled. Dick Thompson, who was one of Phil's stalwart members, had lashed the flagpole, a temporary flagpole, I might say, to a sledge caravan. And when Phil gave him the nod to unfurl the flag, gave a tug, nothing happened. 2 tugs, still nothing happened. 3 tugs, and the mast fell over. much to the merriment of the assembled multitude, except for Phil. Because in actual fact it was quite a serious moment, because the Australian government were trying to get as many claims as they could along that section of the Antarctic coastline, in order that the Norwegians and possibly the Americans couldn't take over their claims. The whole thing about claims is rather silly, my personal point. There was a strict, but this is all very strictly set out. There has to be, you have to do the protocol. If you don't do it rightly, the claim isn't recognised. So here, I've since recognised that science is used as a sort of a scapegoat to give credence to the national claims in Antarctica by countries from both the northern and southern hemispheres. And a little bit of reading will see that it's political. Almost all expeditions have had a political background to them, and science is used as the sort of excuse for doing them. I think probably the only one that I know of that wasn't was the Scotia expedition from Scotland. I've also come to believe that Phil's passion for publicity, and some people know about that, was as much due to his desire to further the cause of Inari as for his own personal esteem. Well, how did he come to be there? In the early 50s, at number 1 North Wharf in Spencer Street, just next to the Spencer Street Bridge, the good ship Wongala would often dock. Wongala. It was about 500 tonnes, had a strong wooden hull and boasted sails as well as engines. It was not remembered fondly by Phil, although in a roundabout way it was a factor, one of the factors in him becoming director of the Inari. Originally she was the fishing vessel Fainfjord, built in Norway and launched in 1919 as a herring boat. She had a well-rounded bottom, like Nansen's Fram, which ensured that she wouldn't be nipped by the ice. The ice would come in underneath, she'd be squeezed out like a pip. The rounded bottom, though, gave her a rather fearsome reputation of the ability to roll in dry dock, or so it's claimed. In 1933, Lincoln Ellsworth and Sir Hubert Wilkins, the Australian, bought her and changed her name to Wyatt Earp, after one of Ellsworth's boyhood heroes. After they finished with her in 1938, following a landing down at the Vestfold Hills, the Australian Navy took her over and eventually renamed her HMAS Wyatt Earp. As an aside, Ellsworth supplies came with the ship and were put in Bond Store in Adelaide until taken over by Inari. I remember that Phil had some magnificent fur mittens from that store, and when Commander Ike Schlossbach, now there's a name for you, United States Navy retired, who had been with Ellsworth, he was navigator of the submarine Nautilus when Wilkins tried to go to the North Pole. He'd been with everywhere. Yeah, they couldn't keep him away from the Antarctic. He came down to Mawson with the 1956 Relief Party, and we were able to reunite him with his old sheepskin flying jacket. He was just completely overcome. He had come down with that 1956 Relief Party. The man in charge of the Relief Party was Bill Busher, who some of you might know from the Melbourne University Walking Club. I also remember from that store there was whiskey, which was bottled during the Prohibition in the States, and was literally firewater, for it could be used to prime the primers. In extreme emergencies, it could be used to prime the primer who was priming the primers. It didn't last long. As a further aside, I think I should say something about those early days, post-war period, when Inari began. For as most of you will remember, they were a time of great hope that the world might return to some sort of normality, and that young men and women could plan a future with some confidence that they might have a future. It was just as a veil had been lifted and the future beckoned. For instance, in my own personal life, Tasmania's Federation Peak was unconquered, and the Bass Strait Island of Redondo, pristine, with pristine vegetation on, untouched since the sea rose 20,000 years ago. So it hadn't been explored, and I was able to get in on both those. It was a great time to be alive, and you could go up to Central Australia, and there were no tracks out to Ayers Rock. For Phil, the opportunity for adventure came when Sir Douglas Mawson, I might be more than 20 minutes. For Phil, the opportunity for adventure came when Sir Douglas Mawson urged the Australian government to send an expedition south to establish a scientific base, so that Australia's claim to a slice of Antarctica might be better recognised, especially in view, as I said before, of the Norwegian and American exploration in the area. He also suggested that his old base at Macquarie Island, where he had his relay station, be re-established, and then the British government got in on it and said, we'd like you to take over Heard Island because the Americans might have a crack at it. And so we took over Heard Island as well. Doc Evatt, Minister for External Affairs, became enthusiastic about the whole scheme, and an executive committee of exploration and exploitation of the area claimed by Australia was formed under the auspices of his Department of External Affairs. It was decided that Group Captain Stuart Campbell, who had been a pilot with Mawson on the Banzari expedition, he seconded from the Department of Civil Aviation and became executive officer of the expedition. So Douglas suggested that the HMAS Wyatt Earp be refitted by the Navy in Adelaide. In July of that year, though, he was appointed Senior Scientific Officer. He and Campbell didn't get on at all well. When sailing back to Melbourne on her, he had to go across first of all to Adelaide and check out the work on the ship to make sure there was enough room for scientific work. And on the way back to Adelaide, they ran into bad weather, and he became so seasick that he passed out on a coil of rope on the deck. And some sailors had to carry him below. Interestingly enough, I met one of those sailors last year. In fact, it was such a bad case that the captain, Commander Boom, Royal Navy, suggested that he should not sail south at all. But of course he didn't know what sort of man he was talking about. Phil was not a good sailor, but he never made that an excuse for not fully carrying out all his workload. He was a most determined person, most determined. After the failure of the Wyatt Earp to reach the Antarctic continent in 1947. It was obvious that the Wyatt Earp would not be a suitable vessel for any further investigation in the Antarctic. And neither was the other vessel which the NRE had at that stage, HMAS LST 3501, later called the Labuan, which was used to establish the two island stations at Heard Island and Macquarie Island in 1948. Now, all this leads up to this particular fact. Thus it was that because the Wyatt Earp was so unsuitable, the establishment of a continental presence was put on hold until suitable shipping became available. And Sir Douglas Mawson was the man who put that idea forward. This gave Phil the opportunity to become director of the NRE, for Group Captain Stuart Campbell could not see himself carrying on with just two sub-Antarctic stations instead of being in the real thing on the Antarctic continent itself. So he resigned and went back to a permanent position with the Department of Civil Aviation. And so Phil became director. Phil, who saw the scientific value of the island stations, accepted the directorship in 1949, and that's when I first met him. He was bouncing with enthusiasm and for his ventures that were coming up to him. I was at Melbourne Teachers College. Which way? Is that right? Yes. At the time when Phil's father was principal there. At the same time, my friend John Bechervaise was giving a series of lectures at the old museum, and I used to act as his gopher, you know, show his pictures and take up the money and all that sort of stuff. And one night Phil came as our guest lecturer, and he showed us a picture of Big Ben on Heard Island, that big volcano. Well, we put in our bids to have a shot at it. And 3 years later, 3.5 years later, we were on quite a small vessel, which had docked just on the other side of the river from where the Wangali used to dock, at number 1 North Wharf. So we had number 1 South Wharf and number 1 North Wharf. It's where the conference centre is now. This was the motor vessel Totten, which had begun life as a corvette, as a U-boat hunter, and was being built on the Clyde by Mr. Brown. The war ended before it was completed, so it was towed across to Norway, where it was fitted out as a coastal steamer, passenger ship, and powered by some engines which they got from Mr. Blom and Voss down in Hamburg. So we had the U-boat hunter being powered by U-boat engines. It wasn't a happy marriage, and I certainly wasn't alone in wondering which one was going to win. For instance, the U-boat engines had a bad habit of breaking down. The first time when we were going to Heard Island, it broke down just outside the heads. The story about Phil's leadership style concerns the Totten. In 1952, the Inari store was out at the Air Force Depot at Tottenham, here in Melbourne. For several months, we gathered out there and we worked on all sorts of things, making tents, packing boxes, and so forth, and getting our year's supplies ready for shipping, under the watchful eyes of Mr. George Smith, who was a large 6'4.5" sort of man, with well-built and big booming voice, under George's guidance. The Totten arrived in port, and George asked us to turn up earlier than usual the next day and get a load of semi-trailers off with the cargo. And this we did, and while waiting for their return, we were filling in time, doing as little as possible. Well, the big black limousine turned up, and out came Phil. He took one look at us, just loafing, and went straight into George and started to berate George. It was a bit like a Daily Penguin talking to an emperor. George, you know, what are these people doing? Why are they just sitting around smoking? Why aren't they working? And George waited till he finished, and then he said, looking down, he said, well, Phil, I asked the blokes to come out early today. We've sent off the first loads, and we're just waiting for the semis to come back for the next ones. Well, said Phil, why didn't you tell me? To which George replied laconically, "Geez, Phil, you didn't even ask." Phil just said, "Oh," and walked back to the car. I was flabbergasted, but Phil was quite unperturbed. The problem of not having a suitable ship was solved when Phil heard that the Danish Lauritsen Line had built a ship specifically for the Greenland trade. Although not a real icebreaker like the American Wind class, it was registered to navigate in ice. There's a similar one on your menus. Phil did some wheeling and dealing with the government so he could get it. And by sacrificing Heard Island base, where I'd been, and offering to transfer some of the buildings and equipment down to the proposed new station, Phil persuaded the government to charter the Kisterdam for the 1954 season. And so began this remarkable association between Anari and the Lauritsen Line, which lasted for 30 years, the last ship being the motor vessel Nelladan, named after Phil's wife, Nell. The Kisterdam made an Australian station feasible. With Phil on board, it called at Heard Island to collect 5 of us from the Heard Island party, and then went over to the French base at Kerguelen before heading south to set up the Mawson station. On the way home, we came back and picked up the rest of our Heard Island crew, and then went back to Kerguelen before returning to Melbourne. I was standing on the wharf chatting to a Frenchman who said to me, "Dr. Law, he is your director?" And I confirmed this. "But you do not show him any respect." "When we wish to speak to Commandant Monsieur Amago, we make an appointment. But you people, you just call it, 'Hey, Phil!'" I think probably liberté, égalité and fraternité have a different meaning for us to what it has for them somewhere. But I wonder if, I don't think he was there later on in that afternoon. I remember looking at my diary. Phil threatened to flatten one of our men who became a bit of a pest. I think he probably had too much French hospitality and he was making a pest of himself. So Phil went up and said, if you don't shut up, I'll flatten you. And we all knew that Phil was the champion boxer, so he'd shut up. Phil's infectious enthusiasm was a vital element in gathering around him a band of men and women who willingly worked long hours in both the offices and down at the stations, with no thought of any overtime. Men like George Smith, whom I mentioned before, Lem Macy, who was an incredible man, could do almost anything, and Dick Thompson, who was... These 3 men were triumvirate. They were wonderful men, and without them I think Phil probably wouldn't have got nearly as far on as he had at that time. He could rely on them. If somebody might have Kathleen Ralston's biography of Phil, if you have, there's a picture of the 3 of them in that. Well, they were great men, but they were very loyal men, but they were, as you realise from what I said about George, they were no means servile. There was times when Phil's enthusiasm, for instance, reached the gung-ho variety. A bit too often. In spite of the fact that it took 6 hours to free the Kister from the newly frozen sea ice when we were about to leave the new station at Mawson, Phil wanted to do some more work down south. He wanted to get some accurate fixes on land masses or land features that have been photographed by Operation High Jump, a big American operation that photographed almost the whole of the Antarctic coastline in one hit. They had a... Pardon? No, sir. They had a few spare aircraft carriers and they could just scatter them around and do it. But the thing is, aerial photographs are no good unless they can be tied in with the actual landing and making a proper survey in those days. Skull and Monolith was the first place we called at, a rather forbidding looking place. Dick Thompson, Arthur Gwynn and Phil were taken in with Jimmy Brooks and the ship's second mate, Bill Peterson, ran the boat in. When they got in there, they found a high ledge of ice barring their climb up onto the rock. Phil was all for taking a running jump and landing on it. Dick told him not to be such and such a fool, and they turned back. That wasn't quite the end of it. I've got a note in my diary that there was a fairly heated exchange on the deck when they returned to the Kister. But the most serious case of his excess enthusiasm occurred not long after he was insisted that Captain Peterson take the Kister down into pretty much uncharted territory, back down to the Vestfold Hills, which I've mentioned before when I was talking about the Wyatt Earp. And it's where Davis Station now is. It was too late in the season to be there, and it wasn't well charted. I've been on boats that hit rocks there. After we left, Jimmy Brooks was able to get a fix, so that was all tied in. But after we left, we got hit by a hurricane with winds in excess of 200 kilometres an hour, gusting up to 300. And the ship broached. The bows were so high that the cargo, with all the cargo out, and they couldn't retrim the ship because all the pumps had frozen. And so she broached, and she was being blown sideways round past icebergs, going backwards and forwards, dodging things like this, occasionally a great crash and things like that. The biggest list, she had a normal list of about 30 degrees to port, and at one stage she was over at 74 degrees. She was just lying in the water. If you can imagine this room, lying over at 74 degrees, most of you would be on that wall, if that was the bow up there. It was one of those interesting moments. The remaining Oster, our two Oster aircraft had been smashed up by the wind at Boston, and the airframe fitters had done a wonderful job and rebuilt one down the hold of the ship, and temperatures below freezing the whole time, and it flew. But it got wrecked. It was up aft and started battering the lifeboats. It collapsed, you see, and the battering lifeboats, and so the second mate, Bill Peterson, had to cut it loose. He was sprayed in this very, very strong wind, 200 kilometre an hour wind and freezing cold and wet, sprayed with aviation fuel on his hands, and he was screaming with pain, and he couldn't write for at least a month. He said he's never suffered such pain. And the fourth engineer spent his watch in very cramped quarters, clearing the engine water intake, which is normally well below the surface. But with the list, it had come up to the surface, and all the brash ice was going into the engine room intake and stopping the water getting in for cooling the engines. So he spent a terrifying time down there, so much so that he lost his nerve and he never went to sea again. Phil admitted that he'd made, and this is the thing about Phil, he would admit his mistakes. He admitted he'd made a grave error of judgment and to put the lives of all of us on the Kister down in jeopardy. I once heard him say to a group of people he'd never been so terrified in his whole life, not only for his own safety, but for knowing that if the Kister capsized, the Australian future in Antarctica would have gone down with her. And these things can happen. You see, in 1958, the last time I was down there with the Taladan sister ship disappeared in the North Atlantic with all crew. Nobody knows what happened to her. It was exactly the same sort of ship as we were on. So these things can happen. But after that, Phil certainly made sure there was a future. He'd been given a reprieve, and so he worked night and day until he got everything going again. He was helped to do this to a certain extent by the Russians, because the Russians came and put their big base on Mirny, right in the middle of Australian so-called Antarctic territory. Well, it upset a few people and certainly loosened a few purse strings in Canberra. And so Phil was able to get a whole lot of stuff he could never have got otherwise. At that time, some of you will remember, there was no Russian diplomatic representation in Australia after the Petrov affair. And there was a rumour going around that the Russians were putting in submarine pens. Some of you will know Osmer White. He's a highly respected journalist. And he was sent down by Casey, who was External Affairs Minister then, on a very, 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 very secret mission to see if there were any submarine pens or any signs of armament down there. Ostensibly, it was just a report on our trip. The Russians were most hospitable, most hospitable. And after we had a wonderful banquet, huge banquet. There was singing. The Russians sang like the Red Army Choir. And when they asked us to sing, we didn't know what to sing. But afterwards, Osmo was standing outside in the snow, looking at a bust of Lenin, and he felt a hand on his shoulder, and he looked around, and there was Monsieur Tolstakov, who was OIC. And Tolstakov said, "Well, Mr. White, have you found any submarine pens?" There were no reds under the beds at all, no. Before we were told, Phil instructed us that we had to be good ambassadors for Australia and warned us about the iniquities of vodka. But aero vodka, also called de-icing fluid, wasn't mentioned. It was super iniquitous. Later in the day, two very large Russians in their big black uniforms and black hats were escorting Phil back to the ship, mainly because he could hardly walk. Alex Brown, who I was talking to on Tuesday, was about to photograph this funny thing, and he lifted his camera, and one of the Russians said, "You take photograph, we shoot." Well, he didn't and they didn't. Most of us, though, will remember Phil, and I remember him very fondly. Most of us will remember Phil, a relaxed and happy Phil, cigar in mouth, in a smoke-filled saloon on the ship, leading the singing with his piano accordion, which he played very, very well. Cartons of Tuborg and Carlsberg skidding round the deck as the ship rolled and backwards and forwards, making it a very interesting operation. In actual fact, when you try to open a can, it's been shaken up for about half an hour. Finish up with half the can up the deck here. "Hey Phil, can you play Smoke Gets in Your Eyes?" yelled somebody and starts to sing it, while Phil valiantly attempts to find the right pitch and key to suit the voice. Luckily, he was a good musician. There were certainly memorable times with Phil. At Phil's 90th birthday celebrations, one of the speakers said, "There were many times when he could have screwed the little bugger's neck, but we're all here tonight because of him, and we're all here tonight because of him."
Questions, please? You would like to ask some questions?
You mentioned the ship, I think it's the Kirsten, that had the terrible list and the other problems. How were they resolved so that it returned safely?
They're able to pump, once we got clear of the bad swell and so forth, they were able to clear some of the ice, and they pumped water in some of the deep tanks. Now those tanks had held diesel, but there was no other water, and until they were able to produce some more water, we had to drink diesel tainted water. I think I burped diesel for about a month. It didn't make me run any better. That was a problem. When she went back, they had to go into dry dock because one of the plates had been smashed on the hull. And then when we got back to Denmark, we went to the shipyard to see if it was made, and they put a much heavier bottom on it to try to stop it rolling a bit.
questions? Must be more questions, surely.
No, it was very good.
Yes, that was very
Very good.
Almost left no stone unturned in the
I left a lot of stones unturned.
Well, I mean, it's only 9:15.
Yes, keep going.
Yes. Well, I don't know how to follow that, but obviously I can't. It was a magic insight to what took place in those days. I can remember as a teenager these Maladans and Thaladans being reported on the ABC radio news. Just like in 20 years later we would be following Apollo 1, Apollo 2, Apollo 3, they were on the news, you know. And Antarctic exploration was certainly a thing that was there in the 50s, which we'd all remember. But Fred's given us that insight which you can only get from a certain person who was participating in those days. And we've got lots of anecdotes there which really expanded our mind and just makes you think about what these people went through. I was thinking to myself during the meal that the people in the Antarctic would not have been able to enjoy a fresh lettuce salad as we were enjoying. They had many privations, not to mention terrible cold and diesel tainted water and things. So, but to have someone with us tonight who has a personal link to the great man has been very valuable, I think, to all of us tonight. I think Fred has touched on some of Dr. Law's attributes. He was a university champion, Australian University champion boxer. He's quite an accomplished musician. He, after his Antarctic days, he was very instrumental in the education system in setting up the secondary colleges. And there are a number of these areas that he was very influential as a public servant and a person in the community. So tonight we've really heard that dramatic period of his life, and it's been really wonderful. So Fred, thank you very much on behalf of everyone here tonight and coming along and sharing with us. And you know where we are now. You'll be very welcome any other time in the future. And we have here a couple of small mementos which we hope you'll enjoy and remember the pleasant times you had here tonight with us. Better than diesel tainted water, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to our staff who found such a talented, experienced person to share the evening with us. And the evening is still going, so by all means continue to enjoy your company with each other. And otherwise the evening is concluded. So thank you again. Bye.